coming out tonight, and thank Lorna for putting on this forum. I am part of a group called the Common Core Forum. We are a group of parents and that is a totally volunteer base that go around the state and educate people about the Common Core. I formed the group last year because I had already spent 2 years on the Worcester School Committee as an elected official. I am also a professor at the college, been there for 20-something years, adjunct professor, and I have a daughter who's in the public schools at the moment. I have other children, but they've graduated. And I realized that I started to do a lot of research on Common Core back in 2011, and I realized that this was really not the right path for Massachusetts. So a year ago, we decided to start like an umbrella sort of group to encompass all the small activists throughout the state that are working to eradicate Common Core. We spent yesterday at the State House lobbying our elected officials, and we had great success. Over 100 people weathered coming into Boston, which I'm telling you, that's a big commitment to come into Boston, into PARCC, and to walk to the State House, and then to do something that you're very uncomfortable doing, which is lobbying, because you don't even know how to do it. I mean, most of us don't know how to do it, but we did it, and we were able to make our voices heard. So this is the kind of work that the Common Core Forum does. If you have not liked us on Facebook, or you have not checked our Facebook page, our website out, do that. And I'm going to just pass around, Jamie, if you can just give me this. This is a sheet. This is an additional sign-up sheet if anybody wants me to include them in our, like our news blasts. Right now we're in the process of trying to collect signatures to ask the governor and the Secretary of Education to stop Common Core. So our goal is 20,000 signatures. We're at, I think, 3,000 in a week. So we've done very well. And we also have other things coming up with the Department of Secondary and Elementary Education that we want to have our voices heard there too. So these emails are something that we will notify you if you're interested. That's just mine. And the list only goes to me. It's not into a database. It's not going to be shared. It's just me, okay? And also too, the petition is held by my website and me. It doesn't go to like iPetition or any of the other companies that collect data. It just goes to us, and we don't use it for anything else but to notify you of things coming up. So it will not be sold. And I know people are kind of concerned about that. So tonight we have two expert speakers here. What I will do is I will introduce both speakers, Jamie first and Sandra after Jamie finishes talking, and then we will have a period where is the most important period is the questions and answers. And the reason why this is the most important is because we don't know what's happening in your community, and in order to understand what's happening in community, it's really important that you know, and I know a lot of you have questions probably about the PARCC assessment that is taking place now. Now, are you at have they given the PARCC assessment yet, or is it in the process? Okay, it is. Okay, just so we kind of know. Okay. So, Jamie Gass, our first speaker, is a Pioneer Institute Director of the Center of School Reform. At Pioneer, he has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability as Senior Policy Analyst Technical Writer and in the State Budget Office under 2 Massachusetts governors. In the 1990s, Jamie worked for the Dean of the Boston University School of Education, Boston University Management Team, in its historic partnership with the Chelsea Public Schools. He has appeared on various Boston media outlets, WBZ's Night Side with Dan Ray, WRKO's Tom and Todd Show, WBZ Kelleher at Large, WGBH Callie Crossley Show. He has been quoted in The Economist, Educational Week, the Boston Globe, and his op-eds are regularly published in the Boston Herald, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, the Lowell Sun, the Providence Journal, and other regional newspapers, as well as national op-eds and magazine articles in the Wall Street Journal, Educationalness in City Journal. Jamie speaks on academic standards, school choice options, the school accountability at events throughout the country. He earned his bachelor's in arts and international relations from Boston University. Please welcome Jamie Gass.
So first of all, I want to thank Lorna and Donna and Michael for all the good work that they've been doing setting up events like this over the last 6 to 9 months or so. Donna's set up, I think it's probably over 40 events all over Massachusetts, and I really applaud her and Common Core Forum for all the work that they're doing. And I'm grateful for you taking the time on a busy evening to come out and listen to what I think is an interesting topic that has a big, big impact on what will be happening in our children and grandchildren's classrooms. So to begin, I'm just going to tell you what Common Core is, because the fact is that even though 40 some odd states have adopted Common Core, the reality is a great number of parents, a lot of state legislators, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country, really have no idea what it is. So what Common Core is a set of national English and math standards that were developed by the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Those are two Washington, D.C. based trade organizations that represent not states, but they represent the governors and the commissioners of education for each state. The lion's share of the funding for the development of Common Core and advocacy for it came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You all know who Bill Gates is. He was the CEO, founder of Microsoft. And then the Common Core will be matched with there are two national testing consortia that will develop tests. They're in the process of developing and piloting tests all over the country. In Massachusetts, that's the PARCC testing, which if it is followed through with its design, will replace the MCAS test as the high stakes graduation test for Massachusetts. There's another testing consortia called Smarter Balance, which represents largely a lot of the western states. And those two testing consortia were funded by the U.S. Department of Education, about $360 million. And there's some issues around the funding and transparency around this, which I'll get into in a little bit. But to begin, I just want to give you some of the context that helps us better understand how we arrived at this situation where we're talking about Common Core, we're talking about state standards, national standards. And in order to do that, I've got to give you a little bit of context about education reform in this country and sort of how we got there. But to do that, I want to start off with a quote from someone who knew a lot more about governance in this country than anyone else alive, and maybe anyone else in the history of the country, and that's James Madison. He was the father of the Constitution. He drafted the Bill of Rights. And he wrote this in 1790. 2. If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their own hands the education of children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. I would venture to declare it as my opinion. It would subvert the very foundation and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the people of America. So the Founding Fathers, I always say, were very wise. They understood that the national government has particular purposes. It is foreign policy and trade and defense, but that most of the issues that most directly impact the lives of the citizens, and particularly school children and teachers, are really the proper legal and financial jurisdiction of the states and localities. Even after about 50 years of sort of gradual and incremental growth in some federal role or national role in education, 90% of the funding for your schools come from the state and local governments. In a community like Carlisle, it's well over 90%. So this is your money, and these are your decisions. And this is, I think this is the vision that the founders had. I mean, the U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on K-12 education, and that's not by accident. Whereas the state constitutions, whether it's the Massachusetts Constitution, which is the oldest written constitution in the world, written by John Adams in 1780, or the Virginia Constitution, they're very clear and specific. There's paragraph after paragraph talking about the future interest of legislators and lawmakers to cherish K-12 education, and it's the responsibility of state governments to support these things. So this sort of arrangement of the national government doing the things it's supposed to do, and the state governments and local governments doing what they're supposed to do, I would argue has actually served this country pretty well over the last 200 plus years. We've essentially gone from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to the most powerful country in the world. I mean, it's no small accomplishment. And the uniqueness of this idea of ideas and leadership and ownership of work in K-12 education coming from the local level is really distinct and unique. I mean, commentators across the centuries have said, what's unique about this democracy is that the ideas don't all come from on high. They don't come from kings or queens or czars or ministers in some central kind of command and control way, but that the ideas and ownership of things that are most connected to the lives of our children are owned by the parents and by local officials, right? It's a pretty commonsensical idea that people who live thousands of miles away don't necessarily know best what what's best for your child, right? And this arrangement's served pretty well, but there's no question by about the late 1950s we began to run into troubles. We had for many, many years been considered among the higher performing countries in the world in K-12 education. But in 1957 there was an event called Sputnik, and that's when the Soviet Union launched a satellite into orbit. And people began to panic because not only were they our political competitors, but there was also concern that we were not going to be able to compete economically, that we weren't generating the numbers of scientists and engineers and people in the hard sciences in order to compete economically in the second half of the 20th and early part of the 21st century. And so much so that in 1983 there was a report called A Nation at Risk. It was authored by a commission, it was authored by the Reagan administration that said that if we had this system of public education imposed on us by a foreign enemy, that it would be an act of war. We had fallen pretty dramatically. The evidence was clear that we had gone from among the top tier countries in the world to about 17th or 11th in the world, and that this report was very, very concerned that we were losing primarily our economic edge. And so what happened is that some fits and starts throughout the 80s, there were a variety of different education reform efforts. There were people that thought that you need to have more school choice so that through things like charter schools or vocational technical schools or private or parochial schools that you'd inject some competition into the public sector, which would help stimulate improvement and hold schools accountable. But around this time, and I mean it's sort of been around for a little bit, but around this time they began to kind of become some of these players in Washington, D.C. I mentioned the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the Chamber of Commerce, that said, no, the way to compete in the 21st century is going to be with national standards, national testing, and national curriculum that are going to be dictated from Washington, D.C. The Nation at Risk report had not said that. It said, because everyone, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, everybody across the spectrum had pretty much known that there are limits on what the feds can do in terms of participating in K-12 education. And so this was a new kind of departure. But what Massachusetts did in 1993 was really quite unique. Bill Weld, who was a moderate to liberal Republican governor, got together with Tom Birmingham, who later became the Senate president, pretty liberal Democrat with a great relationship with organized labor. Mark Roosevelt, the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, also pretty liberal Democrat and a state rep. The three of these men got together, and again, Republicans and Democrats. I mentioned that their party affiliation only to show that this was bipartisan in its composition, right? So the Republicans and Democrats, key leaders, got together in 1993, and what they came up with was the landmark 1993 Massachusetts Education Reform Act. And there's lots of complexity to this law, but you can boil it down to a couple different things. They were going to put a lot more money into the public system, so a minimum threshold that all communities had to spend, and then they were going to have a very, very progressive funding formula so that the lower performing poor districts like Holyoke and Springfield and Lawrence and others were going to get an enormous amount of state aid. In exchange for all that money was going to be high stakes testing, so MCAS testing, high quality academic standards based in English, math, science, and history. We're going to get back to the fundamentals of academics, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. We're going to do teacher testing so that teachers are held to the same high academic standards that the students are being held to. Charter schools, so independent public schools that are highly accountable, to give parents some more choice. And this was sort of the grand bargain. It made for not only good policy, but good politics. And it really has led to remarkable historical gains. The basis of those gains, though, and you're fortunate enough to hear from Sandy Stotsky in a few minutes, who was the architect of the academic standards, was this deep commitment to, in English, classic literature, poetry, and drama. As it turns out, things like Huckleberry Finn and Sherlock Holmes and Dickens and Emily Dickinson and Longfellow. I mean, you can't frankly go very far in Massachusetts without bumping into the home or the birthplace of some remarkable historical literary figure. But and Massachusetts is proud of that. But it turns out that the quality of the vocabulary and the complexity of text in classic literature, poetry, and drama is the game changer, right? For decades, there's been sort of these fads that have blown in and out of K-12 education, where we're going to do informational text, or we're going to have nonfiction being taught in English class. We were going to do, fuzzy math. We do all these different kind of fads, soft skills. But what they decided to do in the 90s in Massachusetts was say, we're going to do the basics. Kids of all backgrounds and every different zip code are going to get to read the same high-quality books, the kind of books that kids read at really elite prep schools, at parochial schools. We're going to have that level of academic expectation. And the reason why it matters, again, is that the complexity of the texts, the learning to read between the lines, character development, plot development, it just matters enormously. And the test scores really demonstrate that. On the math side, they're going to do the same thing. They were going to observe, and Sandy and a Harvard mathematician by the name of Wilfred Schmidt really developed the math standards in Massachusetts. They were going to learn the best practices from all the high-performing East Asian countries that Nation at Risk report said you got to compete with those countries to compete in the 21st century. So what they did is they looked at California, they looked at Japan and South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore and saw what they were doing. And what they were doing, and now 15,000 pieces of research since that time back it up, is that you have to have access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. That allows students to get on a trajectory in high school so that if they want to study pre-calculus, calculus, and trigonometry and study the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, they've started early enough and they have the coursework both in preparation for Algebra 1, but after Algebra 1 and Geometry and Algebra 2, where they can get there in high school. They can get to the STEM fields. So that's sort of the basics of what the previous standards in Massachusetts had. So there's a test called the NAEP test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's the nation's report card. It's been around for about 35 or 40 years. No state in the history of that test has ever been #1 in every grade tested and every category tested. And in 2005, Massachusetts was the first state in the history of that test to do it. And then we did that again in 2007, 2009, 2011, and 2013. So no state had ever done it once, and we've done it 5 times in a row in both reading and mathematics. Okay? It's a remarkable historical accomplishment within the K-12 world. And the reality is that there's 2 conversations going on. There's what the rest of the country has been doing, which is still basically stuck in stagnation and decline, and then there's what Massachusetts has done, which has led to these historic gains on national tests. I say, this is the equivalent of winning the World Series 5 times in a row and doing it in 4 straight games each time. It is a remarkable accomplishment. The teachers, the superintendents, the school committee members, the parents, the taxpayers, the lawmakers, the policymakers deserve an enormous, enormous amount of credit. It's something that this state should genuinely be proud of. But the Nation at Risk report was also very, very clear. Competition in the 21st century is competing with the high-performing East Asian countries. So in 2007, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country on a test called the TIMSS test, T-I-M-S-S. It's the gold standard of international math and science testing. And that TIMSS testing, and it's true of both in 2007 and 2013, it illustrated that our 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science. In the area of mathematics, and both in 4th and 8th grade, we were among the top 3 or 4 countries in the world, right? So we realized what it is that Nation at Risk report outlined in 1983. Okay, 1983. I mean, I say that if doing well on the NAEP testing is like winning the World Series, this is like winning Olympic gold medals, right? And so in 2007 or 8, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers began to make another push for national standards. And that's what Common Core is. And so in 2009, there was a federal government came up with a federal grant program called a Race to the Top. Here in Massachusetts, we could proudly say this was the race to become Massachusetts. And they had to have Massachusetts, because if Massachusetts adopted the Common Core under this Race to the Top grant, then what could, Louisiana or Mississippi or Arkansas or New Mexico, all the really low performing states, could never say no to it. So this Race to the Top federal grant program, it's $4.3 billion. States had to compete for this money. In order to be competitive for that money, they had to sign on to the objectives outlined in the federal grant. And one of the objectives was signing on to Common Core, and that's precisely what Massachusetts did in the summer of 2010. So when most people were at the beach or relaxing or barbecuing, that's when the State Board of Education decided to replace these proven high-quality academic standards for the Common Core. So Pioneer Institute is where I work, and it's an independent think tank that's been around for about 25 years or so. The current governor, Charlie Baker, was our first executive director. Jim Pizer, who's the Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth now and was the chair of the Board of Ed in the 90s when the standards and the MCAS and the charter schools was all put in place. He was the executive director in the 1990s at Pioneer Institute. We take no government money. We've never taken any government money. 90% of our funding comes from individual donors, so there's no deep-pocketed foundation that's paying for us to have an opinion on this or fight against this. But given that Massachusetts had been so historically successful, we thought it'd probably be a pretty good idea to have someone take a look at the academic quality of the Common Core against high-standard states like Massachusetts and Minnesota and Texas and California. So we enlisted Sandy Stotsky, who had worked in a variety of different states. Even the advocates of Common Core, prior to Common Core, used to enlist Sandy to evaluate and grade the quality of the state standards. And we coupled her with a guy named Jim Milgram, who's an internationally renowned mathematician from Stanford University. I mean, it's very unusual to find a mathematician that actually is interested in K-12 education, but he had worked on the very high-quality math standards in California. And what Sandy and Professor Milgram came up with, they mapped out they were sort of crosswalks, 50-page evaluations of every draft of Common Core against high-standard states. And what they found at every step of the way was that Common Core, in both English and math, was of significantly lower academic quality than what high-standard states had. So it wasn't going to be a race to the top, especially for Massachusetts. It was really going to be more like a race to the middle. Specifically, what the research that they authored for us illustrates is that the Common Core decided to ignore all the evidence from Massachusetts and cut classic literature and poetry by about 60%. So there's no Huckleberry Finn, there's no Charles Dickens, there's no Sherlock Holmes, none of that. By the time kids are in the 12th grade under Common Core, only 30% of what they're going to be reading in their English class is going to be classic literature, poetry, and drama. Again, it's worth reminding you that they put in what they call informational text, which can mean some good things. It can mean things like the Gettysburg Address. I think everyone would agree, Gettysburg Address or Letter from Birmingham Jail by MLK, you want these things. You want kids to be reading these things. The problem is that under Common Core, they're supposed to forget that the Gettysburg Address takes place in consecrating a cemetery. It's supposed to forget that it takes place in the middle of the Civil War. They call this cold reading. And you're basically supposed to forget the entire historical context in which a document is written. And from my point of view, and I love history, this really deadens a topic and a text for kids, particularly young kids. But then there's also a lot of other things that they put in there too, like Federal Reserve manuals and EPA regulations. I mean, if we have problems right now keeping kids' interest in academic subjects, wait till they get, the EPA manuals. I mean, that's really riveting stuff, right? On the math side,
Wait, are these seriously really is in there?
Yes, yeah.
Oh my God.
So,
Recommended reading
yeah.
in Appendix 2.
Yeah, and so under the Common Core in mathematics, they also ignored the evidence from high-performing, high-standard states and countries, and they push access to Algebra 1 really into the late 9th grade and the beginning of 10th grade. I mean, I know this from a variety of different teachers and parents that I've spoken with who had kids in, say, the Lexington Public Schools, under the previous standards, and they've got a kid in there now, and they say, somewhere along the way, a year and a half of math has just been lost, right? But it's not just that they push Algebra 1 forward, and they have an experimental form of geometry that's never been successful in any place it's been tried. And Professor Milgram tells us that the Common Core standards in math really top out at what they call Algebra 2 Light. So if your child is interested in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, there's no pre-calculus, there's no calculus, there's no trigonometry. For the STEM fields, Common Core is really a path to nowhere. The next piece of research that we looked at was the legality, because the fact is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are limits. There are federal laws that prohibit the feds from funding or directing or validating national standards. So we had the General Counsel and Deputy General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration take a look at the laws. And as it turns out, there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding or directing or validating or encouraging national standards, testing, and curriculum, which is precisely what Common Core does. And these federal laws are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson, the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, which is signed by Richard Nixon, and then the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself in 1979, and that was signed by President Carter. So it's worth noting that 2 of the 3 presidents that signed the laws that prohibit the federal government from funding PARCC, as they've done, or pushing for national standards or tests, were signed by Democrats. So this is not a partisan issue. It's really important to understand this is not a partisan issue, it's a legal issue, right? And our pieces in research have been written about all over the country by pretty well-respected syndicated columnists. George Will is one of them. There's a column in the back that cites our research. The next piece of research that we looked at was the cost, because I mentioned at the beginning, 90% of the funding of K-12 education comes from the state and local governments. And so the federal government is not going to be paying for it. They've really kind of encouraged and incentivized states to adopt these standards, but the people at the state and local level are going to pay for the lion's share of the cost of this. So we thought someone should take a look at the cost. We hired a guy who had worked under both the first Bush administration and under the first administration of President Clinton. So he'd worked for both Republicans and Democrats. He'd been in D.C. for decades. He's worked on testing and testing costs with a variety of different states over the years. And he and his team came up with a cost of about $16 billion is what's going to cost for the states and localities to implement the Common Core. For Massachusetts, after we have spent well over $100 billion to be #1 in the country and internationally competitive in math and science, we're going to have to spend another $350 million to align our textbooks, our technology, and our training of teachers with, I think, what are demonstrably lower quality standards. You may be seeing this already. School department budgets and municipal budgets have a variety of different technology costs that are beginning to get baked into their operations. I mean, you're probably seeing a lot of purchasing of iPads and things like that, and that is to do the PARCC testing, right? Which, again, the state is not paying for. Even in this pilot stage, the districts and localities are paying for this. There's a variety of other issues around it. I can get into it there during the Q&A. There are some issues that run parallel to Common Core about data collection, because the reality is that while the founders and for generations we've understood that K-12 education is to develop citizens, really the outlook of K-12 education under the Common Core is really more workforce development. They want to gather lots of data, whether it's academic data or otherwise, on your child, so that they can start kind of picking winners and losers. They can direct kids to certain careers and career paths. There's definitely, I wouldn't say a shop focus, but a kind of vocational outlook. This is not about creating citizens. There's precious little in Common Core that I think you identify as being something really directed towards educating citizenship. But it's really kind of making kids kind of worker bees. That's really kind of the outlook of it, which again is a big shift, because going back to John Adams, through Horace Mann, through the Ed Reform Act, we've been trying to promote citizenship, and the same people that have made the decision for us to adopt Common Core in Massachusetts are the same people that killed off the U.S. History MCAS just a couple of years ago. So it's not a lot of interest in education as a role, shaping citizenship among this crew. The good news about this is that the more parents find out about it, and you've probably seen it in Facebook and Twitter and Google searches, I mean, the more parents and legislators and people find out about it, the less happy they are about it, because the details are a little bit unnerving. So I've given you a lot of information. You probably feel like you've taken a sip of water out of an open fire hydrant. I'm sorry about that, but to kind of give you the ground, the kind of the baseline understanding of it, so that you can begin to kind of digest it and educate yourself on it, and better understand what Sandy's going to be talking about. Kind of have to work through a lot of material, but I appreciate your interest. I appreciate you coming out and listening to us, and I look forward to any questions you might have after Sandy's done.
Thank you, Jamie. Just a couple of things I just wanted to comment on, because we've been doing this, like Jamie said, about 30 times, so I'm thinking of all the things he didn't mention, so I'm going to just mention them. And one of the things he mentioned is when we talk about the MCAS in the park, and I hear a lot of parents say, so it's another test, we're going through another ed reform, our kids have to know how to do, this kind of test. Interesting enough, when we had the MCAS, we owned the table. We owned the test. We could revise it. We could go back. It was done with the teachers' input, with the school committees, everybody's input in the state of Massachusetts. We battled it out. What was it, 2 years before we can even launch it? Okay, remember, the park is owned by a company, okay? We cannot revise it. And we're in a consortium right now. It started with 24 states. Now we're in a consortium with, I think, 12 or 13, that's 42% of the states said, we don't want you, Park, because it's not a good test. And the thing is, we have to set the cut score. Now, the cut score is the passing score. I've learned all this since I've been involved in this. So do you think we're going to have a passing score in Massachusetts the same as Arkansas? Are you out of your mind? But we have to come to a common denominator where Arkansas can pass and we can pass. So our kids will not be at a level where we were before with the MCAS. They will be at a lower level of passing. Let me also make another note that Jamie talked about, this is trademarked. So in the better communities, and I do know you guys are in a better community, and Worcester is not a better community. So you're saying, well, that's okay because we can add 15%, because that's what they're telling you, that's their line. They're not going to be tested on the 15%. So your teacher, and let me tell you, because I know a lot of teachers, I've been a teacher for years, is going to teach to that test. Because their whole evaluation is tied into that test. So that 15% may be like the icing on the cake, but your kids are not going to get that. They're not going to get tested on the 15%. So if your teacher has this passion about whatever, they're not necessarily going to teach that. And going back to the text reading, last summer my daughter's in AP English. Some of you have kids in high school. So she came home with her reading list, 3 books during the summer, okay? 3. One was a classic literature book, AP English. Yeah, okay, we're good with that. I don't care what classic it is. The other one was, I was trying to think of them while we were sitting down there, but I did remember. One was called Capital in the 21st Century. Does anybody know that book? Okay, let me tell you about it in a second. The other one is The World is Flat. They're both books about economics. So what happened was, right, in AP English, I know you guys are getting this. This is not, doesn't take a lot to get where we're going on this. The Capital in the 21st Century is about 400, maybe 600 pages long. I have an undergrad in economics, marketing economics, and I opened the book and I was like, what? This is absolutely college level. Well, they realized as the summer went on, those teachers could not teach economics because they are English teachers. But Common Core, text reading, this is one of the Common Core proof books. So it's So 2/3 of her reading was not anything to do with her subject, which is English. So those are just little points that I was thinking while we were sitting there. Okay, so our next speaker, Sandra Stotsky, is a professor of education in emerita at the University of Arkansas, where she held the 21st century chair in teacher quality. She served as a senior associate commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education from 1999 to 2003, where she was in charge of developing or revising all of the state's K through 12 standards, teacher licensure tests, and teacher and administration licensure regulations. She served on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education from 2006 to 2010, and on the Common Core Validation Committee from 2009 to 2010. She was one of the 5 members of the Validation Committee who would not sign off on the standards as being rigorous, internationally benchmarked, or research-based. She holds a doctorate in reading research in reading instruction at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She has been an active citizen in Brookline for many years, serving as a president of its League of Women Voters several decades ago, as an elected town meeting member for 10 years, and as an elected library trustee for 14 years. She has also served on many school, search, and selectmen appointed committees. Let us welcome Dr. Sandra Stotsky. Now I'm going to move the mic over to Sandy because she has.
You can give me the mic here.
I'm going to give you both mics here, and because she likes to. She has a lot of information in front of her, and it's easier. So, Patrick, if you can just put that in
Wherever you want me to. That's for the video.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like I'm singing.
Is that a mic, Donna? Oh, okay. That magnifies the voice.
Actually, maybe she could take your seat.
Yeah,
Oh, you can take my seat, Sandy. Right here. Okay.
One time we had a little mix-up in time.
Sit over
Sandy
there,
and I.
that's fine.
So she actually did the whole time.
Oh, you want me
On
over
my
here? All
phone,
right.
I put it on speakerphone into the mic. She wasn't here, but we had her on speakerphone. So we have made do in many situations.
Okay, this is fine. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Let me, hold on. Let me just make sure I don't trip on something else here. Hold on to this one. Oh, I hear. Okay. Let me continue in a way where Jamie left off earlier to show you 2 graphs that I think give you a good idea of where we were and where we have come in the state based on the standards we once had before Common Core. Here is the 1992 NAEP 8th grade math. Now, this is, I don't have projection screen here. This is a list of all the states. And this shows you with this black bar, we're about 1/3 of the way down in 1992, which is just before the Ed Reform Act was passed, which is 1993. So here is our performance in 1992 on grade 8 math. This is the average. Now, this is by 2007, we are at the very top. That's the black bar, same list of states. And we are considerably above the next few states. This is what is at stake, basically, as far as I'm concerned. Not the fact that we're at the top, but that we have had such high scores in math, English, and also in science. This is simply grade 8 math. And these gains lasted. Here's where I'm going to go a little bit into my own philosophy because I was behind, as you've heard, the development and revision of the K-12 standards we had in all major subjects. What we were doing, what I was doing, and I had the support of Commissioner David Driscoll, the Commissioner of Education at the time, and the Board of Education, so the stars were aligned in my heaven. My goal was to raise academic achievement for all students because we needed to raise academic achievement for all kids. We had been for 50 years, we've been for 50 years in a decline. And the decline started in maybe the 60s, 1960s or so. So the goal was to raise the bar for everyone. This was part of why the 1993 MERA, Massachusetts Ed Reform Act, was written and supported by mainly businessmen. And then teachers' colleges were dragging their heels, but they agreed to support it because it introduced teacher tests for the first time for incoming new teachers. But the point was that everyone recognized that high school graduates were graduating without very much of a high level of literacy or numeracy, and businesses were beginning to educate students when they felt that somehow, since they had paid for this education in public high schools, more of it should be done there. So that was the first part of the goal that I had in the department in 1999 when I was hired. The second was to make sure that we increased the academic competence of our teaching staff, because for me it was logical. If you want higher standards taught, you have to have teachers who can teach to them. Teachers cannot teach what they do not know, so I had to increase the academic level of incoming teachers, veteran teachers, through professional development criteria and whatever other means we had at our disposal in a Department of Education. And coordinating all of this was my responsibility, in addition to which we had MCAS itself, which began around 98 for the first time. Law came in 93, took a few years to develop, and we had to make sure we had good teachers on the MCAS assessment development committees. These are all long words. You have to get these committees straightened out. And you had to have the right teachers, and they had to be choosing the right passages in English, which was my area of interest, and in reading as well as in English. And you can see them. And I want to point out today that this is a huge difference between what is on the PARCC or the Smarter Balance test and what you had available under the MCAS test from 98 on. By law, all test items have to be released within a year. So people, anyone, could see what were the literary passages, and over half had to be literary, as determined by the teachers on these committees. I wasn't in charge of that. But you can see the level of the literary passages that were released each year from 98 on, particularly after we had the revisions in 2001 for all major subjects. You can see the math test items, grade 10, and then all of the other lower grades, and the coordination that needed to take place. But third prong in my own platform was a focus on knowledge, content knowledge. That was, for me, the important part of all of this, because if you want to develop analytic and then critical thinking, you have to develop a knowledge base. In English, that meant literary historical knowledge. In mathematics and in science, there's a lot of content knowledge. History as well. So here were the kinds of things we were emphasizing in the tests, the standards that would serve as the basis for MCAS tests as well as teacher training. And these are what are at stake since we have had the adoption of Common Core in 2010. And in English, we do not have a content-oriented set of standards. I will tell you a little bit about the problems with Common Core's ELA standards in a few minutes. I don't know how I should be standing in relation to that. Okay. But let me start with my being on the Common Core Validation Committee in 2009. I was one of the less than 30 people chosen to be on this committee because probably of the work I had done. Professor Milgram from Stanford was also chosen probably because of the work he had done with California's math standards. He had been appointed by then Governor Schwarzenegger. I was recommended by our commissioner, Mitchell Chester himself. But everyone knew that I had been involved in the development of standards that promoted the development academically of all students in the state. So here I was on a committee that was charged with ensuring that Common Core standards were to be internationally benchmarked, research-based, and rigorous. And Professor Milgram and I were two of the 5 people on the validation committee who would not sign off because we didn't think those conditions were met by the final version we saw. He had been working actively as a PhD in mathematics with the 2 mathematicians on the committee who were writing the standards. I was never able to get to even talk to David Coleman and Sue Pimentel privately after they started writing the ELA standards, even though I tried, because I couldn't understand where they were getting their ideas from. But the point was that we both knew from the very beginning that these standards that were being developed by Common Core were not where we thought either of these 2 disciplines should be going if they were to be our national standards. That is why he and I have been together on a public speaking tour, so to speak, in about 25 to 30 states in the past 6 years. He's got critiques on his Stanford University website, 6 pages to 13 pages long. He covers math. I can't deal with anything above grade 7, so I just want you to know that. I distribute his flyers that he's vetted, but I don't discuss math beyond the general issues that he goes into. But we have been traveling together and testifying together because state legislatures have been, for the most part, left in the dust. They were in the dark. This gets to what I want to mention briefly as the 4 major groups that were excluded from participation in the Common Core project. And this bothered me from the very beginning because, as you heard, I've been active in town meeting. Brookline, I grew up in an open town meeting kind of town, Bridgewater. So I know all about participation and transparency in what one does politically. First major group that was excluded from participating were parents themselves. Nowhere were they seen. Now, I wouldn't expect parents to be writing standards for any subject, but where were they in terms of review groups to be bounced off of in some way? They had no role. Second group excluded were teachers themselves. There were no high school math or English teachers on the committees that wrote the standards, that developed the standards, that validated the standards. One would have also expected college teaching faculty in math and English. They were not there either. So the 2 logical groups that one would expect to deal with college readiness standards, which is what they're called, were not there. Other kinds of people were there, and they were on the validation committee, but Milgram was the only mathematician, and I was the only person who was considered an expert in English language arts standards. So here we have parents, teachers, school committees, or school boards as they're called in most of the country. None of them were involved in any way. In fact, in Massachusetts, I was told that after the state board adopted Common Core in July 2010, the day after, it sent a little note to all of the local school committees informing them of what it had just voted. And this was the first time they heard about it. Oh, we have a new set of standards coming with new sets of tests based upon them coming too. Finally, and this was deliberate, state legislatures were not involved. They weren't asked to do a cost-benefit analysis of what these standards and tests would cost, nor did anyone from any state board, and I've asked this question wherever I can when I've testified around the country, no one from any state board ever asked what college readiness meant. This is being fudged everywhere right now, today. This past week, we heard that the Delaware Department of Education was sending out an announcement, this was part of the prize behind all of this, that all of Delaware's public universities and colleges would accept whatever Smarter Balance declares to be college readiness in grade 11 and could not give placement tests at their college level, which is the only way, by the way, you can find out whether indeed your college readiness level predicts to college admission requirements. They cannot give a placement test because the deal is if you pass the grade 11 test and are declared college ready, and this is going to happen in Massachusetts, you are then entitled to credit-bearing courses your freshman year. That's why they're called college readiness standards. This was the goal all along for this set of standards. Now, might want to ask, well, what difference does it make? It will make a difference in terms of what your math and science departments in your high schools do, depending upon your superintendent and who you have as teachers in math and science. So it will differ right now for a while, maybe 10 years, but once you have this current group of math and science teachers leaving, retiring, or whatever happens to them, they will be replaced by those who are coming from schools of education who, for accreditation purposes, this is the way this is being locked in, must teach to Common Core standards. And in math and science, as you've heard, the top math course is called Algebra 2 Light by mathematicians, and there is no way to teach physics in grade 12 because the math isn't there. So this is what is in store in the future. It's too early to tell, especially when you have a very good math and science department, as I believe you have here in Carlisle. You are one of the high-achieving communities. I know that from scores that I've seen. And it's not clear what is happening yet in your school system, because even though implementation was supposed to begin several years ago, there is nothing that forces your school committee or your department in your public school system to follow Common Core. It must give the Common Core-based test, which will be PARCC, but your standards that your teachers teach to and use can be whatever you want. This is still part of local control. And I'll go into that in a few minutes, but I just wanted to briefly talk, because that's all the time I have. You have to let me know when you want me to stop talking for Q&A. Someone has to get with...
5 more minutes?
Okay, someone has to tell me when to turn off, because I can go on for hours about this.
Then we have a nice long time for Q&A.
Yeah, Q&A can be anything and is fragmented. But I wanted to point out, first of all, that the people who wrote the ELA standards, and I'll focus on ELA particularly here, were not qualified to do so. That's problem number one, and that should have been picked up by the media. They never looked into their qualifications. And it was something I noticed in '09 when I was placed on the validation committee, which is why I tried to speak to David Coleman, who, by the way, as you may or may not know, is now the president of the college boards. And he is now busy aligning down the SAT to the Common Core level at high school and changing all the AP tests and syllabi. You may not see them this year because they may still be the old ones, but they're all being changed. They're all being lowered in academic content. The SATs, I won't go into the details, you can read it if you just Google about how they have been changed already. And they may not have been given this year, but they will be given in the coming year. I'm not sure what their time schedule is at this point, but that was part of his charge. He became president last year of the College Board after, as I call it, wrecking the ELA standards for the country, and more than that, because what he has embedded in that document has something called literacy standards, the last 8 pages, which deal with how you teach reading and writing in other academic disciplines. And that's what you have to also inspect to see how history is to be taught in the age of Common Core, cold reading of historical documents, as Jamie described for you. This is what is now being recommended as, quotes, a way to level the playing field. You've got to understand there's a motivation behind this, and some of these catchphrases begin to give you a hint of where their thinking is coming from, even though there's no evidence, by the way, to support it. Because the evidence that we have, the only evidence, comes from Massachusetts and a very different philosophy. Content works for all kids, and strong standards work for all kids. There are a lot of people who just won't accept that route. In any event, we have ELA standards that have several major flaws, and I've detailed them for the past 5 years, and you can read almost anything I've written up on the web. If you want to read my testimony or other things, you just Google Sandra Stotsky, Arkansas. I have a home page, and I put everything there. It's secure, and people can read it. But the first thing you need to know about Common Core's ELA standards, well, no matter what your teachers tell you, is that they are mainly content-free skills. They're not content standards. They don't address specific literary or historical knowledge, as did many of the older ELA standards. For example, we had one that our English teachers put in that reads this way: analyze the character, structure, and themes of classical Greek drama and epic poetry for grades 9 and 10. Now, what does that rather esoteric sounding standard refer to? It refers to the Odyssey, the Iliad, or the Aeneid, which is commonly taught in grade 9 or 10, and it used to be in most Massachusetts high schools. What is a Common Core standard? It is something like, and let me give you one here. It's a mouthful. Determine 2 or more themes or central ideas of a text and analyze their development over the course of the text, including how they interact and build on one another to produce a complex account, semicolon, provide an objective summary of the text. That's all one standard. Now, my English teacher, when I went to Bridgewater High School, would have X'd that out and said, write it over again. Break it up into several different sentences and so forth, and let's get a comprehensible statement out of the whole deal. But that's how they read. So you've got a serious problem with unqualified writers who've never written before a set of K-12 standards, particularly literature standards, and this is what you're facing. Now, there are some other issues. You've heard about the increase in informational text, decrease in literary text, an emphasis on writing over reading. I happen to know the research cold on reading. For 100 years, we've known that good writers have been good readers. If you want to produce good writers, you have to have a lot of reading. You may not get good writing from a good reader, but you certainly won't get a good writer if that person isn't being exposed to good English prose consistently over many years. This is known for every language in the world. In any event, you have a lot of time being spent not only in the English class on writing, but in math too. Half of math has become, in the elementary grades, a language-based subject. Mathematicians are absolutely flabbergasted by this because they know that that isn't mathematics. It's symbolic use that matters. But if little kids have to spend a good part of their time in school explaining their reasons as writers, this is not how instructional time in math is best spent. It's a question of priorities for how you use instructional time. And if your schools in the elementary grades are following the Common Core curriculum, this is what you should be probably seeing. But I don't know what's happening in Carlisle's elementary schools. I just hear. And this is why parents are beginning to revolt all over the country. They're looking at the lessons, but of math particularly, in the elementary schools, and they can't figure out what's going on. Engineer dads and moms are looking at 4th grade lessons and cannot figure out how to even answer the questions. And they don't know how little kids can write several paragraphs of explanation of why they think 375 is more than 250. This seems a little bit tough for a young kid to explain. Conceptually, it's not easy for children to explain something that is understandable to them in different ways. In any event, you have a number of problems, which I have laid out, so I won't say anything more about it. Now, the question is what one might do about it. And you have the tests being given now. I'm going to sort of end very quickly by saying that one of the big movements across the country is called the opt-out movement. Parents can, and they have the right, no matter what you are told by a Department of Education, statutes do not require parents to make their kids take the test. They require school systems to give the state test that the state board has adopted. but they do not require kids to take it. So the opt-out movement has become one of the major waves. In New York State, there was just an article yesterday that they have in some schools more than 50% of the kids not taking the test. Why does that matter? Because if you don't have 95% participation, the test is invalid. This is the validity issue. So this is what they're aiming for in New York State in particular. That's one strategy that parents are using everywhere across this country. Another, and I've just come across these questions, Halifax, for example, selectmen voted to put on the ballot in May an anti-Common Core question. Request the legislature to do X, Y, and Z. I won't read the language. A number of towns and cities in Massachusetts on the warrant for town meeting or on whatever local ballot they may have for the election this May are putting questions on. Now, you have to get selectmen or a city council to vote approval, and of course many school committees are not voting, so this becomes a political hassle. But if the selectmen vote to put it on the ballot or on an article, in an article on the warrant, then it gets voted on. And in towns where the selectmen agree, they trump the school committee. So you have to understand a little bit about procedure, because there are an awful lot of parents now beginning to look at what's in state statute, what does local control mean, what are the powers of locally elected school boards. First time this has happened in hundreds of years, but it's a new phenomenon everywhere. People are looking to see what's in their state constitution.
I just have a quick question. Is there any penalization to do that?
Penalties must be voted on by local school committees. No one else has the right. State boards are not elected in most places. In a few places they are, but still, that's not a statutory power. State departments of ed certainly don't have the right. They're bureaucrats, appointed people. But who has the right to set penalties or consequences? Locally elected people who represent you. That's a basic political principle. This is what I've been trying to help people understand. There are certain basic political principles involved here. State legislatures can trump locally elected school committees because they are also elected by the people. Governors are administrative branch, and departments of ed are usually under the administrative branch. So if you want an instructional alternative, which is what some states are now telling people they can have, if you don't want your child to take a test and want more time on instruction rather than testing, you then ask for an instructional session as an alternative to the testing session. And if your locally elected school board or school committee agrees, they direct the superintendent. Remember, that's the way it's supposed to work. People have forgotten. A lot of people think the superintendent tells the school committee what to vote for. Happens everywhere, not only in this state. But the locally elected school committee, and I have the statute because I got something from legal counsel to Massachusetts Association of School Committees, who looked to see what was actually in Massachusetts law. And as far as he's concerned, the school committees in this state, and it's true in almost every other state, have all the legal authority that they've had for 400 years. Parents have the right to keep their kids at home if they want. School committees have the right to set penalties or consequences if they want. That's a local vote. I'm trying to find what I had here. Sorry, I know I've got it here somewhere, where I had quoted from this person who was looking, I'll find it afterwards, that superintendents obey isn't used, must manage the schools according to the direction given to the superintendent by the school committee. That's the legal relationship.
They take directive.
Yeah. The school committee is elected by citizens to direct the staff they hire. And if the school committee says that there shall be no penalties to students, then there shall be no penalties to student, and the staff can't make up one. Superintendents can't make up one. Department of Ed can't make up one. I mean,
We
there's
did
gotta
that
be-
in Worcester last year.
Yeah,
We did that in Worcester. We directed, I wasn't on the school committee at the time, but I was the one that started it
I
off.
think I must have left it over here,
And
whatever
what
it
we
was.
did is we directed, per request
Sorry.
of the parents in Worcester, to have the superintendent not have any penalties for the parents that opted out, and thus to have some kind of a educational alternative.
I guess my question was actually, you had mentioned that the selectmen could vote to put an anti-Common Core question.
They
on the
could put it
warrant.
on the ballot.
So say an overwhelming majority supports that.
It's an expression of opinion. It's a non-binding resolution, as they're called. Tewksbury did this last fall. They put something on the ballot. It was an article on the warrant, and they voted at open town meeting. I asked for the information on how many voters voted. Curious, because it tells you how many people show up for an open town meeting. And it was like 85 to 40 or something like that. But the question was worded in such a way as to say, do you agree with or not agree with Common Core? So it's an expression of opinion, that's all. It's a non-binding resolution. This one that Halifax selectmen are doing says request the legislature to do something. It's still non-binding. But
But it's
at least,
symbolic.
but at least it tells you
Yeah.
where to go. That's what it's trying to do, direct where the selectmen, or whoever is going to be conveying this information, according to the wording of the particular question, where they're going to take it. It doesn't mean the legislature has to do anything about it, but this is a way to get opinion voiced not only by parents, but by teachers.
And the school committee can't say we are not going to use this.
If the selectmen confront the school committee in a town, and this may be a bylaw issue, I wouldn't know. I mean, towns may have different bylaws, so I don't want to generalize from, say, one town or Brookline that I know this would be the case. Whatever the selectmen in Brookline determine, that's what goes on the ballot.
The other thing to keep in mind too is, of course, that both the selectmen or the city council, they set the school department budget. Right? So that there's a variety of different leverage points that municipal government has over the school committee or the superintendent.
One of the things that you have to be aware of, when we started last May, when the school, okay, so we were going to choose between the MCAS and the PARCC, district by district. There was this, in each district was to decide, do we want to go forward with the PARCC or do we want to go forward with the MCAS? Well, we as a group, and we as in Common Core Forum decided that we would start to educate and lobby all the school committee members throughout the state, and there's thousands of them. So we wrote individual emails to each one of all these thousands, and there was probably about 50, 60 of us that wrote all these emails to say, do you understand that it's your decision, not the superintendent's decision, whether you go with the MCAS and the PARCC? Over 50% of the school committee members said, you're wrong. We had to educate them. And finally, it flipped around, and because remember, school committee is elected by us, the people. They, in turn, hire the superintendent. The superintendent makes suggestions to the school committee, and the school committee says nay or yay. Well, we've become very lazy in Massachusetts, where the school committee just rubber stamps in a lot of communities, especially in Worcester, what the superintendent says. So,
Donna, let me read what actually
Okay,
I found
go.
what I was looking for.
Yeah.
This comes from Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 71, Section 37. That was what I wanted to find out. Where is it in the statute? And the legal counsel for MASC said, the school committee, this quotes, in each city and town and regional school district shall have the power to select and terminate the superintendent, shall review and approve budgets for public education in the district, and shall establish goals, educational goals and policies for the schools in the district, consistent with, this was after Mira, with the requirements of law and statewide goals and standards established by the Board of Education. That is what governs local control in Massachusetts. And as he concluded, the authority of a school committee, local school committee, to establish educational goals and policies is central to the mission of the school committee. That's it. That's according to statute, and he looked into the I mean, that's what a good lawyer would do. He would look into all the statutes to find out where statute has been cited in any court cases that have ever come up. So this is the history of what we have. It is not the superintendent's decision. In other words, it is your school committee, and I have been urging, and this is happening all over the country, we have suddenly new people interested in running for school committee, school boards all over the country, trying to make sure that they put in school committees as they were intended to function, to set policy and goals.
Well, I just want to, and we're going to open up for questions in a second, and I'm not going to reveal what town this is because it's kind of a secret thing that's happening. But we have parents that are very, very upset with the Common Core. The school committee has not listened to them. They are running their people on the ballot. They're going to win it. And what's their first order of business? They're going to fire the superintendent. And they're going to get somebody in that will listen to them. So we have the power as parents. You guys have to step up to the plate and run for your school committee. If it's too late to put your name on the ballot, go on a sticker campaign.
Well, Donna, they have to decide whether they like Common Core or not.
Right.
I mean, if they like Common Core, then they're not going to do
If you
this.
like it, then okay, that's fine. All right.
I mean,
So
that
let's
they have to
open up
argue about in a
questions. We got
political
the first
battle.
one in the back. You want to stand up so we can kind of hear you?
Curious if Massachusetts has such high standards, why they went along with it.
Okay, $250 million. I was on the state board, and we were being promised by Race to the Top, $250 million by USED. Governor Patrick was a friend of President Obama, and we were promised 200.
Chester.
And, well, Chester was the commissioner, and he was going to follow the orders.
So did we get it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, of
We
course
used
got
it.
But
We
it's,
used
but
it.
it's,
Which
I
is
mean,
gone
it's-
as of last year.
so,
It's over with.
Massachusetts spends about $9 billion annually at the state and local level on support of K-12 education. And Common Core, I mean, for Race to the Top, we got $250 million, which, look, that's a lot of money, but it's $250 million over 4 years. It's really a drop in the bucket in comparison to what we're already spending. And so it's $250 million over 4 years.
Why didn't they do that analysis?
Why didn't what?
Because the reality, and Sandy was on the Board of Ed. The Board of Ed at that point was full of people that were supportive of Governor Patrick. They wanted to get rid of MCAS. They wanted to get rid of the standards. They wanted to, get the $250 million.
I think you need to ask them, because I have tried to ask them, why did you dump the best standards? And I was told we needed somehow to move the needle.
Down?
Well, that's the question.
Mara Banta, that was her answer to me. I said, she was chair of the board. I said, Mara, why did we do it? Because I was the only dissenting voice. And she said we needed to move the needle.
She didn't say which direction on the needle, but
The thing that's interesting about it is that both Tom Birmingham, who now is a senior fellow at Pioneer Institute, who wrote 2/3 of the Ed Reform Law, and Bill Weld, the governor who signed it, were both in 2010 and just a couple of years ago when the Ed Reform Act was celebrating its 20th anniversary, both of them publicly made it crystal clear that they were opposed to Massachusetts adopting Common Core or getting rid of MCAS.
Do you know how the new governor feels? Baker?
And you said he was president
So in
of the
2010, Governor Baker, candidate Charlie Baker was clearly and vocally opposed to Common Core. He testified against it.
Sure, but that was 4 years
That's 4 years ago. This time, he has been a little bit, what I would say, kind of ambiguous about it. And what he's instructed the new Secretary of Education and the department to do is have hearings about, not on Common Core, but on whether we're going to adopt PARCC. So those will be occurring over the next several months.
I do have a handout on that too.
And this is the key, is that there will be a vote in November about whether to replace the MCAS with PARCC. That's why it's vitally important that if you're interested in this topic, that you make your opinion known to Governor Baker and the Secretary of Education, because this can be stopped. The reality of it is that the governor could pull us out of PARCC. I mean, just a couple months ago, Mississippi pulled out of PARCC. I mean, states that had a lot less to lose than Massachusetts have pulled out already.
So you can pull out.
You can pull out of PARCC, and if we go with PARCC, everything you heard about tonight gets completely locked in. If we stay with MCAS, then there's an opportunity to reopen the standards and elevate them again.
But you have to realize that our commissioner happens to be the chair of the governing board of PARCC, as well as the Commissioner of Education. So guess what he's going to recommend?
Shouldn't he?
Yes, it is a professional conflict of interest,
Yeah,
yes.
we know that.
But who cares?
Yeah.
The Globe doesn't care. I mean, does anyone care in the state anymore? I don't know. I mean, there are questions to be raised about a commissioner who is chair of the governing board making a recommendation for a particular test. Doesn't matter whether he's making any money from it, I doubt that. But the board is still the board that was appointed by Governor Patrick, most of them. Very few of them have been replaced. So you've got a very peculiar situation. They are also going to be voting on new science standards, by the way. I didn't want to get into a huge topic on that, but they are pretty awful. Why? Because our old science standards, as you should know, required a year of chemistry in high school, and you could teach physics in high school. The new science standards, called Next Generation Science Standards, which have come out from Achieve, they're correlated with Common Core. They're not Common Core standards. Do not offer a full year course in chemistry standards, so it basically disappears as a high school course. And a physicist who's looked at the physics standards, Larry Lerner, for a review, has said you can't teach grade 12 physics anymore because the math isn't there. So this is what this Board of Ed is also going to be voting on. But where is higher ed? We don't know. I don't know in this state.
Yeah, they're implementing the park. Okay.
Along those lines, you keep mentioning that, these analyses have been done along all the disciplines, a Common Core versus MCAS, or what Massachusetts has. Is that actual data, primary data, available for us to look at?
Sure.
What kind of analyses are you talking about?
Like the things that you just mentioned, like what's covered in terms of physics.
Yes, there is an excellent report put out by the Fordham Institute 2 years ago. The chief scientist is named Paul Gross, so you would look under GROSS. And there are 4 other scientists with him who reviewed all the different scientific areas, and they have said what's missing.
Not just for science, but I'm talking English.
Yeah, so you can go to the Pioneer website, all of the analysis that Sandy and Professor Milgram and others have done, and we've done, I don't even know how many, probably 15 pieces of research on academic quality. That's all on our website, and yeah.
Just Google Milgram's name, and you will find a whole, MILGRAM.
I guess what I'm looking for is not so much the final analysis that's done, but the actual grid of, what's in Common Core, what's in...
The closest you're going to get to that is the analysis that Sandy and Professor Milgram did for Pioneer.
And I did have those back there. Did you get a copy of them?
I got them.
Okay, yeah.
I was looking for...
One thing to be aware of, and it relates to when we adopted in 2010, so the 3 analyses that the Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts based his decision to recommend the board adopt Common Core were paid for by the Gates Foundation. So the people that paid for the development of the standards then paid for organizations to evaluate the standards, and lo and behold, those 3 organizations found that Common Core was as good or better than what Massachusetts had before. I mean, there's fundamental, the conflicts of interest have conflicts of interest. You don't have to believe in conspiracy theories. When an organization is funding the development of the standards and they're paying for the evaluation of the standards, that's not even close to being objective or independent analysis.
And they're not hiding it either.
And you'll see that, you're already beginning to see that in relation to PARCC and MCAS. We did an op-ed just a couple weeks ago in the Boston Herald outlining that some of the organizations that are beginning to advocate for Massachusetts adopting PARCC have taken, in some instances, as high as $17 million from the Gates Foundation.
The Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education, Executive Director Linda Noonan, and they just came out with a report 2 weeks ago, funded heavily by the Gates Foundation, saying, go with PARCC, not MCAS. Well, PARCC hasn't even been given. We don't have results from it. So how can you even talk about what it predicts? We don't know what it predicts. But they're already claiming that it predicts better than MCAS.
Yep.
So that's one report. Then there's going to be a Fordham Institute report, which has also gotten Gates Foundation money. No bid. They've been asked to do an analysis sometime this summer after PARCC's tests are all through. And one can expect that they will also come in with a recommendation to get rid of MCAS and go with PARCC, but they've also been given Gates money, millions, to promote. So we don't have independent sources of information. Even the tests have been aligned down to Common Core, which is part of the problem. So far, NAEP has not yet been aligned, but the SATs have been aligned down, the GEDs, that's the General Education Diploma, has been aligned down, and there are other, ACT has been aligned down, even though it depends which day you talk to somebody in ACT, that's the other testing company. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. It's never happened before.
Nobody from Harvard Graduate School of Ed said anything about this.
Yeah.
Like, no university.
Well, Paul Revel is there as a lecturer,
So,
but he was behind all of this.
He was one of the people that accepted the Race to the Top grant. He used to be the Secretary of Education.
He was Secretary.
I think, to kind of encapsulate it, really in November there's a decision. There's a decision to go with the MCAS, which we know has led to historic gains on every measure of academic achievement, international and national. Or the PARCC, which really we don't know. And the fact is, look, I'm a father, I've got a 3-year-old daughter, an 8-year-old daughter. If you were staking the academic future of your child, right, on a test, you'd probably want to base it on, or you'd want to stake it on something that has led to historic gains, not something that is, soon to be developed in working in concert with, New Mexico and Arkansas, and that the state officials won't control it. That's the reality. Is if we adopt PARCC, then we're just one of 12 states, and we have no control over really what is either tested or taught in our schools anymore. And yet we got to pay for it. That's
The gentleman right here, that's,
Yeah, I think, Bill Gates and, using, these iPads and iPads to learn how to read, what have you, apps. And what we're talking about is privatization of public education dollars. And that's the real problem. That's what I see to be a problem. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, so you're absolutely right. Donna mentioned at the beginning that these are two private trade organizations. The Governors Association is a private trade organization. The Council of Chief State School Officers are private trade organizations. If a public official even wants to do a Freedom of Information Act search or find basic transparency about why they picked the authors for the Common Core, what they paid them, what was the criteria that they used to develop the standards, what was the rationale, the Governors Association is under no obligation whatsoever to release any of their decision-making about it, and yet they have the copyright on it. So these standards cannot be revised or changed
no mechanism.
without their approval. There's no mechanism for it. It's also true of the PARCC test. So under MCAS, we have a state contract with Measured Progress, which is a company right over the border in New Hampshire, and it's a state contract. So if you want to change it, if the governor, the Board of Ed, the state legislator leaders want to change that, they have control over that. But PARCC is a private testing organization from Washington, D.C., in concert with 12 other states. They own that test. We have no control over that test whatsoever. So you're exactly right. It's not only that state legislators were bypassed, it's not only that there was no bills in Congress or any hearings, and our sort of deliberative democracy on several different levels was bypassed. The people that really own and drive this are private interests. And there's fundamental issues about the public trust and how that is upheld in a democracy. I mentioned in my remarks about the importance of teaching kids civics. That was the whole point of public education, going back to Jefferson and the founding era. What are we teaching our children if the people that are elected or people that are appointed to enforce the law are brushing the law aside, circumventing democratic processes, and then turning these decisions over to private entities who are not accountable to the public? It's a horrible anti-civics lesson, in my opinion.
we had another question. Who was it? There was a woman, right in back, yeah. Was one of you guys in back there? I'm sorry. Okay, that's great.
I have a question for any one of you. We had a local issue where 3 or 4 weeks ago, from nowhere came a need for another school principal under the guise of that we need to adhere to rules from last July that were passed regarding disciplinary issues. Is there anything tied to Common Core in the regulatory or the paperwork or more reporting, that we, as a smaller town, need more administration from a Common Core standpoint? Because this came from nowhere, it caught many parents off guard. It came from an email from our town newspaper that there was a dire need for another principal. And I'm just wondering if there's a correlation with guidelines or regulations from Common Core in any way.
I don't think so. There's a general problem that's been occurring both nationally and even in Massachusetts, where more and more of the education dollars are going to administration rather than into the classroom. I mean, I think what the architects of ed reform did right was that there are a couple levers: state test, state standards, state funding, teacher testing, that the state can do well. But I think that they understood and were respectful of local control, and that the people that are doing the work have to own the work and are paying for the work. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've enjoyed so much success in the state is that they got that balance right. But I think that there's nothing in Common Core standards or in the PARCC testing specifically that talks about hiring a new principal or kind of making things more bureaucratic. But the problem is that if the outlook is changing from a kind of workforce development model where it's being dictated from Washington, D.C. or by trade organizations, it is going to become more bureaucratic. I mean, I think there's a fundamental tension that's going on more and more in education between the bureaucrats. And this is really, Common Core, from my point of view, is an effort that's by, for, and of the bureaucrats. Most of the people that are driving it are not academic experts. They're not internationally respected mathematicians. They're not experts in the liberal arts. They're sort of bureaucrats that have been kicking around Washington, D.C. for decades. And some of them are Republicans, and some of them are Democrats, and some are from business. But they basically think the decision should be made from Washington, D.C., even though the evidence is overwhelming that none of the trade organizations or the major players pushing Common Core have actually improved student achievement anywhere in the last 25 years.
I'm just going to address one issue in the budget that I didn't pick up when I first was on the Worcester School Committee, is that we had, and I don't know if you guys have them here, coaches, curriculum coaches.
Oh, literacy coaches and math coaches.
We had every school, all 44 schools, we had coaches, and they are grant funded. So my concern was, once the grant ran out, where would they go? And what I didn't understand at the time is that, this is prior to my knowledge, full knowledge of Common Core, was they were there to implement the standards. And you also have what they call PARCC fellows in your school. I don't know if you have them in your school, but they are PARCC fellows. And they receive a stipend from PARCC as well. So there are little things grant funded, so you don't see it in the budget, but they're slipping in through. And one thing in Worcester they wanted to know is, with these 70 or so coaches, or whatever, how many they had, would they continue in the budget, which means we have less discretionary funding. And we have to now subsidize all these coaches, which was driving in place to put the Common Core standards in place, which I didn't see it even coming.
So one of the things I wanted to mention to Donna's point was what I took away from the recent school committee meetings were, with the adoption of the Common Core and the implementation of PARCC at our school, there was now a new teacher evaluation component that goes along with that.
That was part of Race to the Top application.
Okay, so this was the piece that was going to demand so much more administrative support, and we were going to need to do a very involved teacher evaluation process, and that was one of the reasons why they needed to add the second principle. And this is also associated with the implementation of the Common Core and the PARCC test.
Yes,
that makes a lot of sense.
So that runs, so under race, the state had to adopt Common Core. It basically made a promise to replace the MCAS, or the state test, with one of these testing consortia tests. But a third piece of it is the teacher evaluation. That was not present under ed reform. There was some provisions that called for teacher evaluations, but that was to all be handled locally. And
so this is the federal.
Right. It really is a federal initiative. And so unlike
in our local schools.
Yeah. So unlike the previous state standards, MCAS, and then some kind of local evaluation of teachers. What this is national standards, national tests, And actually, the testing consortia have been funded and directed by the U.S. Department of Education to develop curriculum materials too. So there's a curriculum component, and then which is then stacked up with the teacher evaluations. And what will be different is that when teachers, I always use this example. So Moby Dick was written in Pittsfield, right? A teacher in Pittsfield could teach Moby Dick, but the fact is that it's not in the standards, it's not going to be on the test, and the difference between Ed Reform in Massachusetts and what Common Core offers is they're going to be evaluated on it. So self-interest being what it is, if you're going to be evaluated, it's not on the standards, not on the test, guess what? Moby Dick or what other piece of high-quality literature, that will go. And that's where the teacher evaluations will make this pinch with teachers, not immediately, but over the next couple of years, it'll make it pinch in the classroom and at the school level like it never has before under Ed Reform in Massachusetts.
And so I think that's really important because here in Carlisle and in other parts of Massachusetts, the teachers have that ability, to create the curriculum. The curriculum is always evolving. In this way, with a mandate that comes down from the federal government, and they said your evaluations are strictly tied to this, and you're going to do this. We don't have that, flexibility in order to allow our teachers to be great at like they've always been.
And there are worse speeches coming, by the way, which will be the equitable distribution of effective teachers. You'll have to parse that one and think about what it means, but it's in the language.
In the last 2 years, we've had the highest rate of teachers retiring in the whole country. Massachusetts, because they're fed up with the profession. So now the new crop coming in is learning Common Core and they're becoming a little bit more robotic, where you have the classic teachers that have all this flexibility and want to do all this crazy, they're being pushed out the door.
So I just want to see if I have this straight. There are 12 states that adopted the PARCC, or in Massachusetts, about only 60% of Massachusetts, 50% of the schools decided to use PARCC. The other 50% are using MCAS. For those schools that use MCAS, do they still sort of feel, are they still feeling that flexibility in the way that they can drive their own curriculum?
Well, the thing is,
no, because the test items are all based on Common Core.
Yeah.
You have to understand that after we vote in 2010 by the Board of Ed to adopt Common Core, a conscious decision was made by the Department of Ed, and I heard the person say so, who was in charge of something going on in the department, that every year more test items would be based on Common Core standards, so that by 2015, all of the test items in MCAS would be based on Common Core standards. So then you have to ask, well, what is the difference between the PARCC test and the MCAS test? There are still some fundamental differences. MCAS is a state-based test with a state-set cut score or pass score. The PARCC test is going to have a cut score set by the group of states that belong to it. As far as I know, according to statute, MCAS must still be given in grade 10 as well as in 11, and it may only be in 10. Repeats can be in 11. But PARCC may be this year given in 10 and 11 because there will need to be a change in the statute if PARCC is adopted. MCAS must be given in grade 10 for the competency determination for high school. PARCC is to declare as a grade 11 college readiness test whether kids are ready for college. So it will eventually be only grade 11, but I understand that there's both a grade 10 and a grade 11 version coming out this year because they've got to figure out how to cope with the fact that MCAS is to be only in grade 10. So you have differences between these two tests, but the standards on which both are based are the same. They're going to use that to make the case to go
We can't
with
go
PARCC.
back. If we don't stop the PARCC now, it's going to be difficult to get rid of it eventually. If we stop the PARCC, then we can, like Sandy said, we can go back and we can look at these standards, and then we can start to have the conversation of can we move in a different direction. But once we have, now you're seeing states that have the PARCC. We're just remember, we're only in experimental this year. We have not adopted the PARCC. The vote will be in November with the Board of Ed. And that's what the 5 hearings are coming up are going to be about, so parents can say, we don't want it.
And essentially you're talking about rescinding control.
Right.
This is what it is.
Yes.
If we choose to stick with MCAS, we control how those tests are developed.
You mean if a state board of ed votes to go with MCAS, but this is a state board of ed that was mainly appointed by Governor Patrick and is now being led by a Secretary of Education who isn't leading in front and by a governor who is not saying anything one way or the other. So you have to guess which way they are going to go unless there is some counter pressure from somewhere
I
else.
think do we have to be out of here in 15 minutes at 8:30?
I don't know.
Okay, so I got a question back here. Can you just stand?
It's not a general election, it's just the only leverage point we have is with the committee. It's not like a general election, get out the vote kind of thing.
No, it's not. I mean, you have to make your voices known to the governor and the Secretary of Education, because the fact is that the Secretary of Education and the governor have budgetary leverage over the Board of Education and the Department of
You
Education.
need to do it as groups.
Yeah, yeah.
Petitions will help.
Yeah,
You've
that's
got
when
to
we
show
started our
if
petition.
you're interested.
If you can, if
That's
you
what
can read, I have copies
Halifax
of the petition.
election.
I don't know if I put them out, but I can get them in my, if you want to see the hard copy. But if you read, we did have this very exact here of what we wanted the governor and the Secretary of Education to do. And you have to do this. He can have an executive order if he chooses to do it. So there is hope. We just can't, that's why we have to get out there in these next 5 times. Okay, in the purple pen.
Yeah. I have, well, 2 questions about how to get out of it. One is, I know that the board votes on whether or not to go forward with PARCC. And Governor Baker can't fire Chester, but can't he fire the board? Can he replace the board?
No,
They have terms of office.
they got staggered terms.
Okay.
So over the next couple of years, he'll have control over it, but he would not have control over it before this decision is being made.
Okay, so my
I have been suggesting, and Jamie disagrees with me, that we start to get a bill developed to get rid of the Board of Ed.
Yeah.
I've asked several states to consider, develop
He's
a
just going
bill,
over this
eliminate the State Board of Ed and the State Department of Ed. It's not structurally in our Constitution.
Yeah.
West Virginia has a problem, it's in their state constitution, so they have to have a constitutional amendment to get rid of their state board. They're considering it, but it has to be.
So something that I saw online said that if there was a change in either the commissioner of the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, Chester, or the governor, who were the 2 people that had to sign on to take the standards, if there was a change in either of those 2, which we have had, that if he didn't sign it within, it says like, that you have to sign it within 5 months to say that you'll agree to stay in. Well, why doesn't Baker just simply not sign it?
Well, that's why people need to make their voices heard to him, because he was against it in 2010. He's been a little bit more ambiguous this time, and he needs to hear. He needs to hear that.
He doesn't realize what he needs to see, because he's in now a kind of a little bit of a bubble there, you know, at the State House. He needs to hear from parents. When we went yesterday to Lobby Day, we had 75 parents go knock on his door and say, we're here. And we made sure that one of his chief of staff took every single one of our names down. That's what we need to do. We need 20,000 signatures on the petition. That's going to get Governor Baker's attention, guys. I'm telling you, we know this will get his attention, because he will say, oh, I guess it's not just Donna, Sandy, and Jamie out there that don't want the Common Core. I know that they're, I know. So these are the things that are so important to do right now, because we have a very short window, and that's why we're here every single night, wherever we can go, on our own time, to tell everybody that we need, this is like a fast-paced thing. Look down here.
There's still something that I don't fundamentally understand about Common Core relative to curriculum. Now, they set standards, and the curriculum will be developed to meet the standards, right? Okay, please explain to me, how do we wind up then teaching algebra in 10th grade versus 8th grade?
Because it's in the standards. So what the standards are, what the standards are is a sequence of what is to be taught at each specific grade. Then it's supposed to be matched with a locally generated curriculum by the teachers and the principals and the leadership at the school level. And so if Common Core and the testing, say PARCC testing, are all aligned with teaching Algebra 1 in the 10th grade, that's what it's going to be taught at.
Let me try to clear this out a little bit, if you don't mind. So does that mean in 8th grade under PARCC, they'll no longer ask any questions about algebra?
No, they will have some.
They'll
There are
some.
some algebra
They'll some.
standards in the grade 8 Common Core. You can't complete Algebra 1, the traditional Algebra 1 course. Say there were 15 standards in Algebra 1.
Is it called integrated math?
No, that's separate. That's
But
different.
it's not stopping school committees to,
That's
it's
right.
not forcing them to
No,
now
school
stop
committees,
teaching algebra.
school committees could
It-
make sure that a traditional Algebra 1 course is
Okay.
taught in grade 8.
Right.
But when the kids take the test, most of what they've learned will not be assessed on the
Right.
test.
And the teachers are going to be evaluated what's on the test, and so the teacher is going to teach what's on the
I
test.
understand all that, and what's going to happen then when eighth grade can take its place if they're going to not talk about algebra?
They've spread it out. You can
They're going to
read,
teach something else, you got to take up the time.
there's data analysis, there are other things you could,
Well, I mean-
geometry, transformations. Take a look at the standards. There are things in the Common Core standards. It isn't like there's nothing there, but you can spend 4 years teaching addition.
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
In
I'm
first
gonna use
4
the-
grades.
Last question, if you don't mind, where are the teachers unions and all this? And what is their
They're
influence
in
in all of
New
this?
Jersey and New York telling
In
parents to opt
Massachusetts.
out. In Massachusetts, where is Barbara Mataloni? We
Well,
haven't heard from her recently.
the president of the MTA has come out very vocally against Common Core and PARCC and standardized testing in general. She just came on board in June, and that's how she got elected. That was her platform to get elected. Now, since then, she has to go along with her board of directors, which are not with her, and I believe she has struggled to get her agenda there. But she did co-write one of the, they co-sponsored one of the bills that is now presently with the House. And I forgot which bill it is. I do have them in there if you want to get it afterwards. And she co-sponsored a bill to get rid of, to put a moratorium on PARCC, a 3-year moratorium on PARCC. The second largest union in Massachusetts is the EAW. They are from Worcester. They have 2,000 members. They have put out a year and a half ago, per my direction, a moratorium on PARCC as well. So the teachers' unions have come out against it, but they don't seem to be doing more than speaking. And trust me, I work on this all the time. I'm not sure where they're going because, you know, they're doing their thing and we're the parent group, we're kind of doing our thing. That's a good question to ask. If you know people that are on the local unions, ask them where they are.
Do they support MCAS or do they want neither?
The present president does not want either.
But the thing you have to remember is that there's going to be a test. I mean, under the No Child Left Behind law, there's going to be a state test. It's just a question whether they're going to have the PARCC, which you will have no control over, really, or the MCAS, which your state officials have control. That's the decision at hand. There's going to be a test. Just question which one it's going to be.
Thank you.
I just want to add locally here that our Carlisle School Committee was invited to this meeting this evening, and so was our administration. They declined to come. And also, I personally opted out by 4 children this year with no pushback whatsoever. You still, as parents, can opt out. There's still testing going on. You can still opt out. And our teachers, I won't say who, support my decision to opt out. Told me verbally that we highly regard your decision. We are totally behind you. Thank you for what you're doing. So I just want to pass it along. You're not alone. There are other families who opted their children out. And you still have time to do that. It sends a strong message to the administration and to the school board here locally.
Just to comment on that, and I think Sandy said a little bit, remember, the union has delegates. The delegates have protection to speak. So if your teacher is not a delegate and they speak up against administration, they will be penalized either by their principal or by the superintendent, and they'll make their life friggin' miserable, let me tell you. So if you are not a delegate, then you have a hard time as a teacher in K through 12 speaking up. That's why you get the teachers on the side that will say you're doing the right thing. And I hear from many teachers every day, but they can't speak up because of they're being penalized.
One of the things I'd like to mention is that, and it's a very important piece of data and information about what the impact is. So we don't have lots of information, but what we know from 2000, so Massachusetts adopted Common Core in 2010. We began to implement it in 2011. We have a NAEP test, Nations Report Card. We're #1 in the country in 2011, 2013. 4th grade reading is the strongest predictor of future academic achievement. Guess what state in the union, after 4 years of implementing Common Core, had the largest drop in 4th grade reading in the country? Massachusetts. So it is having an impact. It's having a negative impact. And it's an important predictor of where we're heading with this. Because if our 4th grade reading scores are dropping, the 4th grade reading scores of 2013 are the predictor of where our kids are heading. It's not heading in a good direction for this state. We got the most to lose, and it's already, the early evidence is we're starting to slide.
If PARCC does get kept in Massachusetts, can parents opt out still without being penalized? Because our superintendent is pushing that you can't. And in fact, she tried to tell us at a Q&A session that we would be breaking the law and that she would have to report our children as being truants.
Wrong. She's wrong. And that's why I tried to tell you, you're going to be getting false information. We're getting it every day from state officials and public officials.
Do they have to educate them while they don't take the test? Or can they just leave them?
No, they're not required to tell parents they have the right to opt out. And parents don't need to pass a bill to say they have the right to do this. They have the right. They've always had the right for 400 years. Parents have always been able to keep their kids at home if their kids were sick, not to have them go on a field trip if they didn't want them to go on a field trip, and they can say, I don't want my child to take this state-mandated or federally mandated test. Teacher tests are different.
Yeah, to add to that, my own experience to that, Peter and I also decided that the kids weren't going to take the PARCC tests, and we notified the school, and they read a book during the tests.
So they don't have to give them a class, they can just leave them to read a book?
Yes, they do not have to educate unless
Right.
your school committee sets up a directive
They have
to
to
your
set the policy.
superintendent. And that's where you need to review school committee.
And what happens if the superintendent is lying to the parents?
Well, this happens all the time, so what can you do? I mean, there's nothing you can do, it's the school committee that hired him.
The thing you have to remember too is that so PARCC has not been formally adopted. That's in a pilot stage right now. So it's not that's not binding in any way. And the other grades are not high stakes, right? So I mean, they test in 3rd, 4th. They tested the various grades. The one that is a little bit you need to be careful about is the one that would be 11th or 10th or 11th grade. That is a decision because they can withhold your graduation diploma if you don't pass the MCAS test.
Well, they can withhold it. No, they can't withhold the graduation diploma. I'm sorry. That is something one State Department of Ed was honest enough to say they did not have the authority to do. No State Department of Ed can withhold anyone's diploma because they are not elected by anybody to make decisions for any purpose. They are appointed professionals in a Department of Ed. They cannot, by statute, make any decision to withhold anyone's diploma. That can only be made by your local school committee or by a state legislature if it has a policy and it passes as a bill. You have to go back to your basic political principle. Who has legal authority by statute? And you have to keep asking yourself, it's like going back to the basic Constitution and understanding what being an elected school committee member or an elected state legislator means. Who can pass laws in Congress? Only senators and legislators by Constitution. Now you can have regulations passed, as we know, by the administrative branch of government. You've got to go back to basic grade 8 civics to understand this, which is unfortunately what most people have misunderstood because they have let superintendents at the local level tell school committees this is what you rubber stamp, and most of them today simply rubber stamp.
But when we tell the school committee you're not supposed to do that, they don't listen to us.
Then you take a copy of the statute and show them state statute. And you keep asking them, if this is what you're saying is the law, show me where it is in the statute.
Yeah.
Call their bluff.
It's not in the statute.
I mean, I read to you what is in the statute. Email me and I'll send you the legal counsel's letter from the MASC because he researched what is in state law. And what I read to you before is what is in state law. So if they're telling you X and they can't show you, I've seen what they put up. They say refer to chapter 70. Well, chapter 70 is umpteen pages long and it doesn't say what they say it's saying. But who's going to read through all those pages of Chapter 70 to find out that the words you're looking for aren't even there?
Okay, we have a question
I
here.
want just a follow-up to all of this is what kind of pressure then is the superintendent and the committee getting if there is no 95%? I'm just wondering what the consequences for them.
So if we were to adopt PARCC, you're saying, because
No.
right now it's,
No,
no,
the
right now
opt-out.
it doesn't
I'm talking
matter.
about the opt-out.
Yeah, we
terms
know,
of the
we know
outcome.
that there are some school
Invalid
committees,
test
you know, like there's
results.
one at Tantascwa out in central Massachusetts said that they weren't gonna adopt Common Core, they did, it passed a resolution. And we know that that the Department of Ed has been leaning on them. And so, I mean, look, what you have to appreciate is that whether it's the US Department of Education or the Mass Department of Ed, they're really good at making people comply. That's what they're compliance officers, the bureaucrats. This is what they do for a living. So they figure out ways to put leverage against people that disagree with them. So they've got different tools to hold back money or
They
what have
threaten,
you. They
but
threaten.
they can't withhold money
That's true.
because lawyers have said that if the Congress appropriates X amount of money for the states, that money must go to the states. The USDE cannot withhold it. Now, if the state has laws that talk about how that money is to be distributed, then you have to deal with it at the state level because now you're dealing with state law. You need a lawyer to help you understand that there are laws that govern this, but no superintendent can tell you what the penalties are because they cannot make them up. They are hired professionals.
But I'm just wondering what pressure she's getting to encourage the 95%.
We know that, I mean, look, the Commissioner of Education, Mitch Chester, he's on the governing board, the chair of the governing board of PARCC, right? So he wants to see districts adopt. Guess what? Even though he's the commissioner in Massachusetts, even though he sits on the PARCC board, even though they've been salting the path for a couple of years to this moment, only half the districts in the state did it.
He gave them a choice.
He gave them a choice, but we know in certain places, particularly larger urban districts, that he's been providing a lot of carrots and sticks to get districts to adopt. And now they're sort of claiming, oh, well, we didn't want all the districts to adopt. They wanted the districts to adopt. They wanted to try to do it through this sort of local adoption, so that when it came time to them trying to do it statewide, they say, well, 70% of the districts already did it. Let's just do this,
That's when we came in last year, and that's
Yeah.
when we totally lobbied the school committees, and we put a lot of pressure. And then we have a lot of friends on school committees. It's not every school committee in the state does. There's a lot of good school committee members. The key is, let's go back to 101, elect school committee members with backbones. Get people on your school committees that will stand up.
Harder than it sounds, no,
So
I
could a
know.
new
I'm
school
now running
committee
for school
kick
committee
out
in my
Common
own
Core?
town.
What?
Could a new school committee effectively kick out Common Core in our town?
They can, by law, they can adopt any set of standards they want. We knew that even 12 years ago. We knew that standards are voluntary. The test is not. And that's the difference.
That's a little.
The State Board of Ed has the legal authority to impose a state test, which is why it needed state-adopted standards as the legal basis for the state-adopted test. There's a legal reasoning that has been followed here and that you have to understand. But superintendents are not elected. They are appointed people. And it's elected people who have to make these decisions. State boards have been given legal authority to make certain decisions, but not others.
Okay,
So,
one more question.
well, the point is, that we can make the decision in Carlisle to go back to the MCAS at least for next year, right? I mean, it's something that if just
That's a test.
No, we won't have a.
You won't have a test.
We won't have, no.
the MCAS is not going to be.
No, they're going to vote on it. The Board of Ed will vote on it.
If the Board of Ed is going to vote on it in November, if they decide to go to PARCC, then it's going to,
Then it's
then
PARCC.
we'll
Okay, I was thinking that we had one more
PARCC.
year.
No,
Because
no. Well, we might
we have one more year, because next year, if they vote in November, the school year already started.
Well, the test.
Only
I
the
get
grade
the
10
test.
students.
The test is administered in
You have to
March
understand,
or
grade,
April. So
grade
they'll
10
do-
students will have MCAS because it has already been voted upon.
Till
And the-
15, right?
Until the class of 18.
Oh, 18.
Until 2018, the class of 2014 can take MCAS because it's a requirement for graduation.
Right.
That's in statute. unless they change the statute. And they're going to be asked next year to change the statute.
So in other words, this vote that's coming in November, it really is for the next school year. I thought we had one more.
No, right now, this is kind of this is a big vote because, as you can see, it's going to tie us into a lot of different things. Well, do you have one more quick?
I just wanted a comment. Yesterday I was at your lobby day, and it was the first time I had ever been proactive in doing something like that. And what I really learned was one of the chief of staffs had said, thank you for coming in, basically, and telling us, because we only hear the progressive pitch from the park people. Yeah. And he was honest, and I thought, gosh, I did do something, it made a difference by doing that. So I would recommend that if you know people, tell them, and then have them write their congressman and Governor Baker.
Yeah, we have the emails too, or you can, if you email me, go to commoncoreforum.org, and we'll get you all the different contacts. But this is something that what we do on a continual basis is we keep, if you don't want to travel, you can do a lot of emailing, because trust me, we do a lot of emailing.
Donna, can you just tell us here about the 5 upcoming events and how important those really are?
Yes, okay. So one of the handouts, thank you, it says let our voices be heard. These are the 5 forums that, if you can read the language here, this is what Governor Baker has directed the new chair of the Board of Ed, Sagan, right?
Paul Sagan. Yeah.
Paul Sagan, to have 5 forums. Now, unlike what Jamie said, one of the language that I was surprised that Charlie directed was it was PARCC/Common Core. So I think it's open for us to discuss Common Core. Now, the Board of Ed is making this, as I just talked to the Chief of Staff the other day, they made it into these PARCC forums. They're not including the Common Core language in there. So that's very interesting. The other interesting thing is, it's at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. How many here work? Okay.
Take the day off.
I know that, but what I'm saying is, it's very difficult for the teachers even to get there. So they made it in very weird, odd places. So I think your closest one is going to have to be North Shore, right?
Fitchburg.
Oh, Fitchburg?
Or
Bunker Hill.
Okay, well, so Fitchburg is coming up as the first one. And we are going to do a lot. We're going to have stand-ups beforehand. We've got 70 signs. We want everybody to know. And they're expecting a large crowd there. But in order to speak at that, you think, when you go through the normal procedures that we always went through a Board of Ed meeting, which means we email or we call. Oh, no, this is not the procedure for this one. You got to be there early, stand in line and sign a piece of paper. And is the special interest groups going to have to stand in line with us? No, they will not. That's what they told me. We're the general public. That's what we are. And they're not going to let us go on. 600 people are not going to speak, she said to me. So they're convenient because this is a convenience for the Board of Ed. They're going to finish their meeting, and then they're going to take a short recess, and they want to go on to this. It's not the convenience for the parents or the teachers. And I'm going to put a letter out tomorrow to the Secretary of Education to inform them that this is not a transparent or a good process that's going through here. Because we're really, really upset that we don't have one in Worcester, the second largest city in New England. So these 5 things are, even if you don't want to speak, bodies, and wear the color red. What happened on today? Because red is gonna kind of prove we're all together. So wear a red sweater, wear a red hat, I don't care what you wear, red socks.
Red t-shirts.
Red t-shirts, yeah, a lot of people wear red t-shirts. It's gonna show some community.
So who was speaking at the meeting? The first few people who managed to sign up?
Yep, they have on the sign-up sheet.
No, but it's the first few.
Well, I don't know, because they have an expert panel there.
Oh, they're providing a panel.
Expert panel. I asked them if they were having you on the panel.
No, find out who their experts
They
are.
wouldn't tell me. I asked her who was on the panel.
These are public meetings, and they won't even tell you who they are.
No, they would not tell me who's on the panel. I asked who was on the panel. She said, we can't release that information yet. I said, I would expect Pioneer Institute would be on the panel. And yeah, I know.
No, it will be only people chosen by the Department of Ed.
I just want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you. I know it's been a long night. Really appreciate your time with us. Thank you.
Exactly.